The taco theory, inside Trump's tariff retreat pattern. For months, Donald Trump positioned himself as the architect of America's toughest trade stance in decades. His speeches promised a new era of economic nationalism built on aggressive tariffs and hardline negotiations. But as households watched their grocery bills climb and markets trembled with each announcement, a different story began to emerge behind the headlines. The tariffs Trump loudly championed started disappearing almost as quickly as they appeared. Brazil's punishing 50% levy vanished. Duties on over 200 everyday food items were quietly erased. His much-touted 100% tariff on semiconductors began fading the moment economists calculated the damage. What seemed like bold policy became a cycle of advance and retreat, threat and reversal. Wall Street noticed first. Economists tracked the rhythm. Political commentators gave it a name that stuck: taco theory. Trump always chickens out. What began as market gossip evolved into a trading strategy, then a shorthand for understanding how modern tariff politics actually work when campaign promises meet economic reality. Understanding the taco pattern. The cycle played out with striking consistency. Trump would unveil sweeping tariff plans in primetime announcements or social media posts. Financial markets would immediately convulse. Companies would issue warnings about supply chain disruptions and price increases. Consumers, already stretched thin by inflation, would brace for another round of rising costs at checkout counters. Then came the pressure, swift, intense, and from multiple directions simultaneously. Stockholders watched portfolios shrink. CEOs called urgent board meetings. Grocery chains recalculated profit margins. Congressional phone lines lit up with constituent complaints about milk, coffee, and beef prices. And almost invariably, the White House would find a reason to step back. In May 2025, Robert Armstrong at the Financial Times crystallized what traders had been whispering for months. He documented how predictable the sequence had become. A tariff announcement would trigger market sell-offs. Price forecasts would spike. Then, within days or weeks, administration officials would signal a change of heart through carefully worded statements or anonymous leaks to friendly reporters. Hedge funds built entire positions around this pattern, dubbing it the taco trade. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity: sell when Trump's threats roiled markets, then buy back in when insider signals indicated another reversal was coming. Some funds reportedly made substantial returns simply by betting that bombastic tariff announcements wouldn't survive contact with economic consequences. The term spread rapidly through financial media, political commentary, and eventually mainstream news coverage. Wikipedia added an entry. Congressional staffers referenced it in internal memos. When reporters finally asked Trump directly about taco theory during a press gaggle, his defensive reaction, dismissing it as fake news and dishonest media, only amplified the narrative. The more he denied the pattern, the more observers pointed to his denials as confirmation. The Brazil crisis, taco theory's defining moment. If the taco pattern needed a case study, Brazil provided it in spectacular fashion. The controversy had nothing to do with trade imbalances or economic competition. In fact, the United States maintains a comfortable trade surplus with Brazil. American companies export far more than they import. Brazilian products that do reach American shores are largely non-controversial. Media: bags of Brazilian coffee beans in U.S. supermarket, beef labeled product of Brazil, orange juice concentrate in grocery store coffee beans, beef, orange juice concentrate, specialized metals, and aerospace components. These goods fill genuine needs in the U.S. economy without displacing American workers or industries. The trigger was entirely political. Jair Bolsonaro, Trump's ideological ally who had lost Brazil's 2022 presidential election, faced legal proceedings over alleged attempts to overturn that election result. Brazil's Supreme Federal Court imposed travel restrictions as part of the investigation. Eduardo Bolsonaro, Jair's son and a political figure in his own right, traveled to Washington seeking support from American conservatives and meeting with Trump's circle. Trump's response ignored trade fundamentals entirely. In what appeared to be retaliatory support for Bolsonaro, he imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, the highest rate applied to any nation during his presidency up to that point. No trade study justified it. No economic analysis supported it. It was pure political theater weaponizing economic policy. The consequences hit American consumers with remarkable speed. Brazil supplies roughly 1/3 of U.S. coffee imports, and prices jumped almost immediately. Major coffee chains raised their menu prices. Supermarket coffee aisles saw double-digit increases on popular brands. Anyone who started their morning with coffee felt the impact within weeks. Beef prices climbed even more sharply. The American cattle industry was already dealing with herd reductions due to drought conditions across major ranching states. Brazilian beef, which helped stabilize U.S. markets during supply crunches, suddenly carried an enormous price premium. Grocery stores raised prices on ground beef, steaks, and roasts. Restaurant chains adjusted their menu costs. The ripple effects touched every part of the protein supply chain. Orange juice, another Brazilian staple, became noticeably more expensive just as Americans were entering peak breakfast season. Aerospace manufacturers discovered that specialized metal components sourced from Brazil now carried tariffs that made production planning nearly impossible. Small price increases across hundreds of products compounded into a significant inflation shock. Brazil's response demonstrated remarkable political skill under pressure. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva assembled an emergency delegation that included figures from across Brazil's fractured political spectrum, even bringing in some Bolsonaro loyalists to show unity. The message was clear. This fight transcended domestic politics. Brazil needed the tariffs gone. Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira made urgent trips to Washington. Commerce officials held tense negotiations. Brazilian diplomats worked their contacts in Congress, where even some Republicans were growing nervous. Agricultural state senators received complaints from constituents about food prices. Corporate lobbyists warned that a Brazilian retaliation cycle could harm American exports of machinery, pharmaceuticals, and aircraft. The political ground was shifting beneath Trump's feet. Republicans underperformed in several state and local elections that spring, and polling increasingly showed voters blamed grocery inflation on tariff policies. Focus groups revealed that the administration's messaging about getting tough with foreign countries meant little to families confronting $7 ground beef and $15 coffee bags. The retreat unfolded in stages. First, the White House announced a suspension of the 10% portion of the Brazil tariff package, framing it as a goodwill gesture during negotiations. Then, barely 2 weeks later, the entire 50% tariff structure disappeared, not just suspended, but eliminated and applied retroactively. Companies that had already paid the duties could seek refunds through customs procedures. Coffee, beef, and orange juice flowed into the country tariff-free once again. The episode lasted roughly 2 months from imposition to complete reversal. Trump had lit a fire, watched it spread to consumer prices, felt the political heat, and extinguished it before the burns became permanent. It was taco theory in its purest form. Trump's promise of a 100% tariff on imported semiconductors represented something even more destabilizing than food price shocks. Semiconductors aren't luxury goods or optional purchases. They are, really the central nervous system of contemporary civilization. Modern cars contain dozens of chips controlling everything from engine efficiency to safety systems. Smartphones, laptops, refrigerators, washing machines, medical devices, industrial robots, and defense systems all depend on steady supplies of these tiny components. The United States designs many advanced chips, particularly through companies like Intel, AMD, and NVIDIA. But the overwhelming majority of global chip manufacturing happens in Asia, especially Taiwan, South Korea, and yes, China. When Trump repeatedly declared that a 100% tariff was imminent, the entire technology sector faced an existential threat. The situation deteriorated further when internal administration proposals leaked to the press. Some officials reportedly suggested that finished electronics could be taxed based on chip count. A smartphone with 10 semiconductors might face 10 times the tariff of a simpler device with one chip. The complexity of implementing such a scheme, requiring customs agents to somehow count internal components in sealed devices, struck industry experts as both technically impossible and economically catastrophic. Technology companies issued urgent warnings. Manufacturing firms that depend on imported chips for assembly operations began freezing expansion plans. Retailers preparing for the crucial holiday shopping season contemplated scenarios where game consoles, tablets, and smart home devices might double in price overnight. Automotive manufacturers, already struggling with chip shortages from pandemic disruptions, calculated that a 100% tariff could add thousands of dollars to vehicle costs. Stock markets reflected the anxiety. Technology sector indices dropped as investors tried to model the economic damage. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and other tech giants saw share prices wobble. The volatility spread beyond pure tech firms to any company dependent on electronic components, which in modern manufacturing means nearly everyone. Behind closed doors, administration officials were receiving stark assessments from their own economic teams. A 100% semiconductor tariff would almost certainly trigger Chinese retaliation targeting American agricultural exports, hitting Trump's rural political base hardest. China could also restrict access to rare earth minerals essential for advanced electronics manufacturing, a leverage point where the U.S. has few alternatives. Supply chains already fragile from years of trade tensions and pandemic disruptions might simply collapse under the strain. And then there was the electoral math. Voters don't care about trade theory or negotiating leverage when their grocery bills rise. They certainly notice when the new phone they've been saving for suddenly costs $2,000 instead of $1,000, or when their child's birthday present game console is nowhere to be found at reasonable prices. The retreat came through leaks rather than official announcements. Reuters reported that U.S. officials had quietly told industry representatives the semiconductor tariffs would likely be delayed, the kind of diplomatic language that usually means abandoned. China's Commerce Ministry responded with carefully calibrated statements suggesting they understood the signals and would hold retaliatory measures in abeyance. Publicly, the White House maintained the fiction. Press secretaries called the reports fake news and insisted no policy changes had occurred. But industry insiders knew exactly what had happened. Orders resumed, supply chains stabilized, stock prices recovered. The threatened tariff faded into the background of unimplemented campaign promises. Another textbook take-home moment. Dramatic threat, economic panic, quiet reversal once the true costs became impossible to ignore. Grocery inflation had been building pressure like steam in a sealed container throughout 2025. Trump repeatedly insisted his tariffs weren't causing price increases, but consumers living through it knew better. Every trip to the supermarket brought fresh sticker shock. Coffee prices kept climbing. Beef reached levels that forced families to reconsider their weekly meal plans. Bananas, oranges, and tomatoes all cost noticeably more. Even specialized items like communion wafers, hardly a major household expense but symbolically significant, carried higher price tags. The economic data told the story Trump's rhetoric tried to deny. Ground beef prices had climbed nearly 13% year over year. Steaks were up almost 17%. Overall, food-at-home costs increased 2.7%, a figure that really understates the burden on lower-income households that spend proportionally more of their budget on groceries. Cocoa, spices, tropical fruits, and fruit juices all showed double-digit inflation. Political consequences arrived faster than economic adjustments. Democrats won key local elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City as voters expressed frustration with cost of living increases. Exit polling consistently showed affordability as a top concern, with many voters directly blaming tariff policies for their grocery pain. Facing this mounting pressure, Trump executed what became the largest single tariff retreat of his presidency. The rollback took effect retroactively at midnight, removing duties from more than 200 agricultural and food products, 237 separate customs classifications spanning 11 major categories. The list read like a supermarket inventory: coffee, tea, bananas, oranges, tomatoes, beef, tropical fruits, fruit juices, cocoa, fertilizers, and yes, even communion wafers. Both the 10% global tariff imposed earlier and country-specific duties were eliminated. Companies that had already paid the tariffs could file for refunds through standard customs procedures. White House communications staff framed the reversal as a reward for progress in trade negotiations with Argentina, Ecuador, Guatemala, El Salvador, and partners in Asia and Europe. Officials emphasized that the rollback reflected successful diplomacy and productive talks rather than domestic political pressure. Industry groups welcomed the decision enthusiastically. Leslie Saracen, president of the Food Marketing Institute, stated the move would help stabilize prices and support manufacturers dependent on imported ingredients. Agricultural importers and food processors celebrated the return to predictable costs, but not everyone was satisfied with the selective rollback. Spirits industry representatives protested loudly that Scotch whiskey, cognac, and Irish whiskey remained under tariff, despite the fact that the United States produces none of these products domestically and the duties serve no protective purpose. When asked whether additional rollbacks might be coming, Trump brushed off the question dismissively, characterizing the change as merely a little bit of a rollback. Calling the elimination of tariffs on more than 200 product categories a little bit stretched credibility. This was a comprehensive retreat driven by the same forces that had prompted previous reversals, economic pain translating into political pressure too strong to ignore. The taco pattern had repeated itself yet again. Every previous tariff retreat Trump executed remained within his control. He could frame reversals as negotiating victories, strategic adjustments, or rewards for diplomatic progress. Markets might have seen through the spin, but politically he maintained the flexibility to advance and retreat as circumstances demanded. The Supreme Court challenge represents something fundamentally different. For the first time, Trump faces the possibility of a rollback he cannot manage, spin, or negotiate his way around. The legal case strikes at the constitutional foundation of his entire tariff agenda. The dispute centers on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law Congress passed to give presidents rapid response capability during genuine national emergencies. Think Iranian Revolution, Soviet aggression, or terrorist financing. The statute was never intended as a general-purpose tool for reshaping global trade relationships or imposing long-term economic policy. Lower federal courts ruled that Trump had stretched the law far beyond its intended scope, essentially using emergency powers to bypass Congress and impose what amount to taxes on American consumers. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to regulate commerce and levy taxes. If presidents can unilaterally impose sweeping tariffs by declaring vague emergencies, the balance of power shifts dramatically away from elected legislators. Oral arguments took place on November 5th, and the questioning revealed deep skepticism across the ideological spectrum. Chief Justice John Roberts reminded the courtroom that tariffs function as taxes on Americans. They make imported goods more expensive for U.S. consumers and businesses. That places them squarely in Congress's constitutional domain. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a conservative originalist, expressed concern that accepting the administration's interpretation would create what he called a one-way ratchet, progressively shifting power from the legislative branch to the executive without any clear stopping point. If this emergency justifies unlimited tariffs, what wouldn't qualify? The financial stakes are staggering. Government data cited in legal filings shows Trump's tariffs have already generated $195 billion in revenue this year. Projected over a decade, the total could exceed $3 trillion. A ruling against the administration wouldn't just block future tariffs, it could potentially require refunding duties already collected, unraveling trade deals, and forcing a complete restructuring of U.S. trade policy. Trump acknowledged these stakes publicly, posting on Truth Social that an adverse ruling could require unwinding more than $3 trillion in tariff revenue. He characterized the case as one of the most important in the history of the country and warned the consequences would be devastating and possibly non-sustainable for the American economy. As the justices deliberate toward a ruling potentially coming as early as December, Trump has escalated his public rhetoric. He has accused critics of the tariffs of serving hostile foreign interests and claimed America will skyrocket in revenue if his tariff powers survive intact. The attacks suggest he understands the vulnerability of his position. For the first time in the entire TACO cycle, the power to retreat, or not, lies completely outside Trump's hands. 9 justices will decide whether his tariff edifice stands or crumbles, and no amount of political pressure, market manipulation, or public relations can influence that outcome. The Supreme Court doesn't respond to polls, market sell-offs, or campaign contributions. Looking across the landscape of Trump's tariff policy, the repetition becomes impossible to ignore. Brazil's 50% tariff, imposed dramatically, reversed completely. The 100% semiconductor threat, announced boldly, quietly abandoned. Over 200 food products, tariffed amid tough talk, exempted under political pressure. Each episode followed the same arc: aggressive announcement, economic disruption, political backlash, strategic retreat. The TACO theory emerged because the pattern was so consistent that traders could build investment strategies around it. The reliability of the cycle revealed something fundamental about how contemporary tariff politics function when ambitious promises collide with economic reality and electoral accountability. Now the Supreme Court threatens to break the cycle entirely. This time, Trump cannot choose his timing. He cannot frame the outcome as a negotiating victory. He cannot pivot to different countries or exempt politically sensitive products. 9 justices will determine whether he possessed the legal authority to impose these tariffs in the first place. Which leaves us with the central question that will shape American trade policy for years to come. Will the Supreme Court strip away the tariff powers Trump claimed under emergency statutes, forcing a fundamental reset of how the United States engages with global commerce? Or will Trump find some legal escape route, preserving his ability to continue the cycle of dramatic threats and calculated retreats? The answer matters far beyond political scorekeeping. It will determine whether future presidents can unilaterally reshape trillion-dollar segments of the economy, or whether trade policy returns to being a congressional responsibility. It will affect how Americans pay for groceries, electronics, and countless other goods, and it will define whether the TACO pattern was a temporary phenomenon of one administration or a permanent feature of modern trade politics. The justices are deliberating now. The ruling could arrive any day, and for once, all we can do is wait.